Hello everyone, we're going to make a React Native augmented reality application with the help of Expo and the Google Poly 3D object library. What our app will do is it will display a camera to the user, and when they click the plus button they will be able to add a 3D object in the world, and they can also search for new objects using the Google Poly library. So right here I'll search for duck, and we'll grab something that looks cool and can swap this out for a penguin, or we can look around and maybe put the dog in there. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is open the Expo XDE and click Create New Project. Now I usually choose Tab Navigation Project even if I'm not making a tab-based application, because it gives you a lot of default files and folders that I find convenient. I'm going to name our project, which I'll call PolySnap, and I've already got a folder picked out on my desktop where I want to place my application. So I'll click Create, and this usually takes a couple of minutes, so I'll pause the video and return when this is finished loading. Alright, the project is finished creating, and one thing I think is a good idea to always do as soon as it's started is to run your project on a device or simulator just to make sure that everything got created correctly. So I'm going to open the simulator right now, and while that's loading I'm going to open up my code in a code editor. So just give 1 second for all of this to load. Alright, so I've got my code over here, and the simulator is still launching. While that's running, another thing I want to do is open a terminal window in the project directory, so I'll click that, and that should give us a terminal window. Okay, and as you can see over here on the right hand side, the simulator has launched the application. There were no errors, everything worked out correctly. So the first thing we want to do in this terminal window is install a few packages that we're going to need eventually throughout the app. The first set of packages we're going to install have to do with Three.js, which is a JavaScript library for rendering graphics. So we'll do npm install -S for save, and we will give it the 3 package and expo-3. We'll press enter to install those. And while this is installing, we'll do a little bit of cleanup of the code over here. Like I said, we did a tab navigation project and it gives you a lot of default stuff, but there's a lot of stuff that we won't need, and so we can just delete it out. So first let's come into the main tab navigator file, and we're going to delete all the references to the links and the settings screens. So that would be the file references. Oops. Here are the actual tabs themselves. And down here is where it figures out what icon to use for the different tabs. And I'll clean this up just a little bit, save that. Then we can delete the files themselves as they're not being referenced anymore. And finally we'll come into the home screen and just delete all of this text out because we aren't going to need it. So right here I'm going to delete the styles. Here I'm deleting some functions that this screen is using that we don't need. And I'm going to delete everything except for the outermost view. And we did delete the container style, so instead of that, why don't we just give some padding. And here we'll put some text that says home screen, just to make sure everything's working. And we can also delete a few of these components here that we won't be using. And let's clean that up just a little bit. Okay, and I'll save it. The app will refresh. I'm going to check on the installation packages. Looks like it installed correctly. And we want to install one more package, which is Expo graphics, so we'll type npm install -S for save and Expo graphics. And this will give us a component in Expo that we can use to render graphics. So while that installs, I'll minimize that And as you can see on the simulator, we've got the home screen showing up here. So a few more cleanup things I want to do. I always delete the layout file out of constants because I never use it. And in the components directory, I always create, I usually delete this styled text file. And I always create a folder. Oh, we got an error over here because we deleted the styled text and it's being referenced right here, so I'll just delete that. I also don't need the web browser, so delete all of that and save, and we can reload. It should work. And I always create a new folder called app components, and inside of that create a file called index.js, which is where we'll reference all of our components that we create throughout the app. One last thing we can do, since we're not actually going to be making a tab application, is come into our main tab navigator and switch this from a tab navigator to a stack navigator. So let's import the stack navigator also from React Navigation and just change this to be a stack navigator. And here are the options that it was giving to the tab navigator. Since we have now a stack navigator, we won't need those options, but we may add some other options as we build the app. We'll have to wait and find out. And I'll save this, and as you can see, the tab went away, so I think we're ready to start actually building the application. Okay, now we're ready to add the camera to our application. So I've got my home screen open, and over on the right side I've got my actual iPhone streaming. The reason for that is because you can't use the camera in a simulator, so you need to use an actual device. In the home screen, we're going to import a few components. First, let's import Expo from Expo, and then we will import Expo 3 and 3 from Expo 3. And we will also import Expo Graphics from Expo Graphics. And you should recognize these as the packages that we installed when we first created the application. Now down here, instead of rendering the text home screen, we're going to return an expographics.view, which is what the component that allows us to use the device's camera and gives us some augmented reality capabilities. So let's give it a style of flex1, and we need to set a few properties on this to get it working. The first one is onContextCreate, and this is just a function that gets called as soon as the graphics context is created. So let's assign that to this .onContextCreate, which is a function that we haven't defined yet, but we'll do in just a second. We also need to set the onRender function, which is a function that gets called every time the graphics scene is rendered. So we'll say this .onRender. And finally, to enable it for augmented reality, we need to set AR enabled equal to true. And we'll come up here and add our functions. OnContextCreate, we're going to make that an async function, and it takes quite a few arguments. One of them is GL, which is a reference to the graphics. It takes scale, width, height, and the AR session information. OnRender takes a single argument called delta, which is the time difference since the last time the render method was called. So let's save that and make sure we don't get any errors. And it's reloading over here on my phone. While that's loading, you need to do a few things to get the 3JS scene set up. You need to basically have a renderer, a scene, and a camera. And so we'll do that in the onContextCreate. So first, let's put a little comment that says initialize renderer. And we're going to create a variable called this.renderer, and we're going to set it equal to an expo3.create renderer. And what that does is it takes a GL context and gives you a renderer back. We also need to set the pixel ratio to the scale, and that just helps us with some sizing constraints. And you also need to set the size itself with the given width and height. If you don't call these last two things, it'll look a little bit weird. Okay, next we should initialize the scene. So we'll put a comment there that that's what we're doing, and we're going to create this.scene, and that's going to be equal to a new 3.scene. And we want to set the background of the scene to the actual augmented reality session, which is the camera with whatever types of graphics we put inside of it. So we'll say this equals expo3.create AR background texture, and we give it the AR session as well as the renderer that we just created. And finally, we need to initialize our camera. So we'll say this initialize camera, and we'll create a variable called this.camera. That equals expo3.create AR camera, and that also takes the AR session and some of these scaling arguments. You can just copy this. I don't actually fully understand what it does, but there's some documentation on 3JS's website that explains what these numbers all mean. And finally, in our render method, all we want to do now is say this.render.render, and we give it the scene and the camera. And if we save that and run it, we should have an AR session running in our application. We'll test it in just a second. All right, so I'll hold this up. You can see there's my desk, and this is looking through the camera of my phone. So we have the camera and everything working. We've also got a whole bunch of errors down here in these yellow boxes, and they're a little obnoxious, so I'm going to show you how to get rid of them temporarily. Sometimes you do want those boxes on there because they can give you some useful information, but in this case, there's not much we can do about a lot of these. So if we just set console.disable yellow box equal to true, then those boxes will no longer appear. And let's just run and double check. And it's nice to have them not on there because we'll be looking into the camera a lot and they just obscure the view. All right, so holding it up again, and as you can see, there's no more yellow boxes. Now we're going to investigate the Google Poly API, which is an API we'll be using to get 3D object information for our app. This is an API provided by Google, and you can find the documentation on developers.google.com/poly. First thing you need to do is click this button right here to get an API key, so go ahead and click that and get your API key, and then jump back over to your code, and let's go into the constants directory, and we will create a new file called apikeys.js. And inside of this, we will put all of our API keys. So we'll export default and create your object here. And let's create a property called Google Poly and put whatever API key you created in this string right here. All right, I've just added my API key, and remember to keep your API keys a secret so that other people can't use them. Since we're not going to be using the app for a little while we do this, I'm going to go ahead and close my preview of the app right here. And let's jump back over to the Google Poly documentation. So it gives us access to 3D objects. It'll give us all the 3D object files that we need to render them in our augmented reality app. It'll also give us some screenshots and a little bit other information that we might find useful. If we come down here to guides, we can click Poly API and get some more information about it. The API, as it says here, allows you to list assets, list your assets, or get a specific asset. What we want to do is use the List Assets API because we're going to allow users to search for different assets, and then we'll display whatever they've chosen. So just a quick overview of this. Here's the request that you use for the API, and here are some parameters you can provide it. You can give it keywords, which is probably what we'll be using for the search. You can specify certain categories like animals or technology. You can specify a format if you want only a specific type of 3D object format. Page size controls how many results you get back from each search. And then page token is a way to have different pages of data. So if we say that our page size is 10 and there's a total of 100 results of that search, we would need to use the page token to get page 2 and page 3 and so on. Down here it gives you an example of what the response will look like. We'll look at this a little bit more deeply in just a second, but the documentation here is pretty good, and it would be wise of you to take a look at it. Another thing you can do is use the Google APIs Explorer right here, and if you look up the Poly API, you can actually test out API calls. So we're using the list API, so I'll click that. And here we can just type in any kind of search parameters that we want. So for keywords, we could look up duck and click, let's set our page size to be 5, and we'll click execute, and it'll actually run this API call. And down here, it gives you an example of what the results would look like. It also shows you what the request itself would look like. We would just call get on this URL, except replace this with our API key. And as you can see down here, we get an array of assets, and each asset has a display name, an author, a description, some information about when it was created, and then this formats array actually has the 3D object files. So there's a .obj, a material file, here's some additional files and different formats. All right, so let's go back over to our code. I'll make this a little bit larger so we have some more room. And what I want to do is go into the API folder and create a file called googlepoly.js. And here we're going to build out a little sample, a little class for working with the Google Poly API. So let's do export default class Google Poly. And let's create a constructor, and the constructor is going to take the API key. So whenever we create a new instance of this class, we'll give it the API key, and then we'll store it in a property called this.API key. And that allows you to use it if you have a secondary API key or you want to use it in a separate project with a different API key. Next thing I want to do is create a function called getQueryURL. And what that's going to do is take an API key and a few other parameters that we decide we want to use, and it'll return us the URL to perform the query. And the URL would be something like this. So why don't we actually just copy this and paste it into our code, and we can look at it as a reference while we're building this out. I also want to make this a static function since we're passing in the API key and it doesn't need any access to any member variables. At least I don't think it will. All right, so let's create a variable here called base URL. And that's going to be this portion of the URL that never changes no matter what the parameters are. So we'll set that. And then we're going to build out a URL based on the different parameters that we want to give it. So as a review, here are all the parameters that are possible. And for our application, we're going to let users search using a free text search box. And whatever they type in, we'll just put into the keywords parameter and show them those results. So let's make a new variable called URL. And that's going to be equal to the base URL plus key equals, and I'm getting this from here. It doesn't matter what order you put the parameters in. I always start with the API key so I don't forget it. So we'll put key equals that plus the API key that we were given in the function. And then we'll say URL plus equal, which adds on to the URL. And parameters should be separated with an ampersand. You can also use query parameter building libraries if you want, but this one will be simple enough that I don't really mind doing it myself. So let's take a look at our parameter options. I think for this app we want to set a page size so that we don't load too many all at one time. So let's just hard code our page size to 10. And back over here, it's got this max complexity parameter, which is an enum, and it takes medium, simple, or complex. let's hard code it to medium so that we don't get too complicated graphics and overload our application. So we'll set ampersand max complexity equals medium. The other thing I want to hard code is the format of the results that we get. I want to limit these results to OBJ files. The other formats could potentially work, but I'm only familiar with OBJs, and so I only want to give users options that have an OBJ file format. So we'll set ampersand format equals OBJ, and let's see, we also want to add the keywords, so let's pass in keywords into our function. We'll say ampersand keywords equals. And since the keywords will come from user input, you need to make sure that you clean that input and don't allow any sort of unsafe characters to get in. So the way you can do that is by calling encode URI component and giving it the passed in parameter. And since we're going to support multiple pages, we also want to pass in a next page token, but this one will be optional since the very first page won't have a next page token. So we'll say if next page token is passed in, then we're going to add that to our URL. And I believe the parameter, yes, is called page token. So we'll say ampersand page token equals and next page token. And finally, we will return the URL. So this function should give us a query URL with a given API key, keywords, and an optional next page token. And another thing I just thought of, just to be safe, if the keywords for some reason were blank, we probably don't want to say keywords equals blank. So why don't we put this around an if statement as well. So we'll say if keywords are passed in, then we will add the keywords to that parameter. All right, now we want to make another function that actually gets the results. So why don't we call it get search results. And this will take a keywords parameter and a next page token. This one's not, I don't want to make this one static. So in that case, we'll have access to this.api key, but we'll still need keywords and next page token so we can build our query URL. And what this function is going to do is it's going to build the query URL and then call the API and return the results. So let's first get the URL. So we'll call the static function via Google Poly.getQueryURL. And the first argument is API key, which we have right here as this.api key. And the next two are keywords and next page token. So now we have the query URL that we need to use. And since it's just a basic GET request, which you can tell from the API Explorer right here, we can just use fetch to get the results. So we'll call fetch, we'll say return fetch, give it the URL, and you need to usually do these kind of thing where you convert it to JSON. So we'll say then function response will return response.json. And then another then, which has the data itself. And what we want to do with the data is take a look at the data that we're given. And it gives us an array called assets. Let's see if it gives us anything else. If we scroll all the way down to the bottom, it's also got a next page token and a total size, which I think is the total number of results. So I think for this function, all we want to do is return the array of assets. And later on, we'll come back and grab the next page token and figure out how to handle our pagination. So we don't want to return the whole data. We only want to return data.assets. And since we're handling this with promises, the way we should do that is return promise.resolve data.assets. So now when we call this, we can use the normal promise syntax and we'll be given the data.assets. So that should be enough for us to test it out. So let's go back to our home screen, and we want to import Google Poly from, it was an API/Google Poly. And remember, we need to go up one level because we're currently in the screens folder. Now let's create a constructor here. And remember, you always need to call super props. And let's create an instance of the Google Poly API class that we just made. So we'll say this.Google Poly equals new Google Poly. And we need to pass in the API key, which we have in our constants/API keys file, which we also need to import. So right here, we will import API keys from /constants/API keys. Now back down here, we'll call API keys.Google Poly, and we'll save that. And let's check the Expo window right here. When we do console.log, some messages will appear down here that we can take a look at. So I'll make this a little bit smaller again. Now that we've initialized our Google Poly object, we can call this.googlepoly.getSearchResults, which is the function we just created. And remember, it takes a keywords and an optional next page token parameter. So for our keywords, we will give it duck. And next page token, since we don't have one because this is the first page, we will pass in a blank. And then we could say .then function, and remember, it's giving us the assets. And inside of here, we should have our assets. Let's just double check by doing a console.log assets. And if we refresh, and I think I may need to run it on my phone, so just 1 second. Yeah, it closed out. So I'm going to scan it on my phone, and all it's going to do is load the app, which should go straight to the home screen, which will call our home screen constructor. It'll generate the Google Poly object, call getSearchResults, and give us the assets. And I've just realized that I made a typo. If I come back over here, it's saying that I spelled keywords wrong. Oh, here it is. Okay. I accidentally misspelled keywords right here, so I need to fix that and rerun it. Okay, so the simulator has launched, and as you can see over here, it tells me that it can't run OpenGL in the simulator. That's what we expected, but all we really care about is the console. And as you can see right here, it has printed out a bunch of JSON data, which is the data from the API call. And if you don't believe me, just as a double check, I'll pull this over here and I'll reload the application by using the command +R button. It's going to relaunch, and here we go. Here's all of our asset data. Okay, so one thing that we're going to do that I think would be convenient is let's take a single asset and copy that data into a file so we can use that as a reference as we're building the app, and we don't have to constantly be calling the API. So there's a few ways we can do that. The way that I want to do it is just grab an asset here. We'll just say assets0, and we'll call we'll create a variable called JSON, and we'll say JSON.stringify, and we'll give it the first asset. And what that's going to do is take this asset and convert it to a JSON string, and then we're just going to display that string in the console, and we'll just from the console copy and paste it somewhere. So I'll save this. I'm going to clear my console here, and as you can see, we've got that JSON data in a big string. So we'll just copy this, and why don't we put this in our assets folder? So we'll come into assets, we've got fonts and images. Let's create a new file called, a new folder called objects. And since we were searching for ducks, I'll assume that the first asset was a duck. So let's create a new file called duckObject.json, and inside of here we'll paste that string. And I'm sure there's a way to format it automatically for you in this code editor, but I don't know how to do it. So I'm just going to put a few line breaks in here, not for the whole string, but just so we can look at a few things in here. There's another property called thumbnail somewhere in here. There it is. I'll put that. Now we can kind of read this. And I think the data that we really need is thumbnail, formats, and probably the display name and the author name. And it says Turkey Day, Happy Turkey Day, hashtag turkey. So this object may actually be a turkey. So why don't we just rename it to turkey object. .json. All right, so just as a way of checking that our object is working properly and that we got all the data we wanted, let's try to display the thumbnail as an image in our app. So if we come over here, we can see that the turkey has a property called thumbnail. Let me just pull this over here. And the thumbnail object actually has a few properties. One's called relative path, one is called URL, and one is called content type. Format some of this stuff too. So I think all we need to do is grab the URL out of the thumbnail property, and that should be in a format that we can display in an image. Let's come back over to our home screen and let's import turkey object from assets/objects/turkey object.json. That should give us access to the turkey object data. I'm going to save that and save that. And down here in our render method, temporarily we will comment out the expo graphics.view, and instead we'll return a normal view with a flex 1. And inside of here we will put an image. And let's double check that we have image in our imports. We don't, so we need to import image from React Native so we can use it. And image takes a source property with a URI property, and the URI in our case will be turkey object.thumbnail.url. And keep in mind that came from, here's the object. We want to get the thumbnail.url property. And we also need to set a width and height, so let's give it a style. We'll say width of 150 and height of 150. And let's save that, and hopefully we won't have any errors. And there you go, there's our thumbnail. This is what the 3D object should look like. It's not the 3D object itself, it's just a thumbnail or a screenshot, but this is what we can expect once we've loaded the 3D model. So let's comment this out in case we want to use it later, and uncomment this section so we can go back to having our camera. Alright, what we're going to do now is allow users to search for any kind of 3D object they'd like rather than having the turkey hard-coded in. As you can see, I'm running the simulator over here on the right because we won't be needing the camera for a while. So in the home screen, I'm going to come down to the render function, and just temporarily we're going to add a view where we can do some experimenting with our UI. And once we're happy with the UI, we will integrate that into the entire app. So I'm just going to return a blank view. We'll give it a style with some padding on top. And save that and make sure we don't get any errors. Since we're going to have a search component, we're going to need a text input to allow users to type in the search that they'd like to do. So up in our imports, we will import text input from React Native. And back down here in our render method, let's add a text input. And let's also add a button that allows them to perform the search. So the title of the button will be search, and on press will be this.onSearchPress. And that, the text input will give a value equal to this.state.searchQuery. And on change text, we will say this.onSearchChangeText. And we'll need to implement these functions now. So let's add them right here. On search change text, we'll take a text as an input, and we'll just call this.setState, and we'll set search query equal to the text that we're given. And the onSearchPress function will look like this, but we'll implement this in just a second. We also want to go ahead and add search query to our state, so let's scroll up to the constructor here. And we don't have a state yet, so we'll say this.state equals, and we'll give it a property called search query, which starts off as a blank. While we're here, we can go ahead and delete this code as we don't need it anymore, and save and reload. Alright, the text input is a little bit difficult to see, so let's give it some style, and we'll add a little border around it. So let's add a new line here, say style equals border width of 1. And we'll also add a placeholder that says search. Let's also set the height to 40. Okay, so we've got a search box here and a search button. It doesn't look great, but we'll make it look a little nicer later on. Now what we want to do is let's create a component for displaying our results. So if you remember down here we had this image of the turkey object. Let's put that in here and take a look at it again. And it looks pretty nice, but I think we also want to add the author name and the display name of the object. And whenever the user searches for something, we'll show a table filled with these objects, which shows the image and the author's name. It's important to add the author's name because the objects are licensed under Creative Commons and you need to give attribution to the author. And the display name is good just so people might have a better idea of what the actual object is. Alright, so let's come over to our components folder and open up app components, and let's create a new file. We'll call this Google Poly asset.js, and we're going to create a new component. So let's import React from React. I'm going to import view, text, and image. We might need a few more later, but we know we need an image to display the thumbnail and some text to display the author name and the display name, and a view to hold everything. So let me spell import correctly, and from React Native, and then we will export default class Google Poly asset, which extends a React.component. And it's going to need a render method, which we will just return a view for now. Fill that in later. But first, let's come into index.js, and let's import Google Poly asset from Google Poly asset, and then export Google Poly asset. All right, now we can access Google Poly asset and other files. Save that, and in our home screen we will import Google Poly asset. So we'll come down here, import Google Poly asset from components/app components. Save that, reload. Now our Google Poly asset will take as a property the asset object. So let's make a default props object, and we'll say asset, which we will initialize to a blank object. And that's kind of a reminder that this needs to take an asset as a property. In our render method now we will return a view. And inside of this view, we'll put all of the thumbnail and text stuff that we need for the asset. So let's flip back to the home screen and scroll down to our image right here. And just copy and paste this so we don't need to retype it. And we'll put this in our view. And instead of source being the turkey object.thumbnail.url, it's now going to be the property asset that we pass in. So we'll say this.props.asset.thumbnail.url. And if we wanted, we could move these styles into a style sheet. So why don't we go ahead and do that now? We will import style sheet from React Native, and down here we'll say const styles equals style sheet.create, and we'll say thumbnail has a width of 150 and a height of 150. And we'll delete these styles out and instead say styles.thumbnail. Save that. Now why don't we try using the Google Poly asset instead of this image right here to make sure that it's working. So we'll add a Google Poly asset, and the asset will be Turkey object. So if we did everything correctly, we should see the same thing on the screen once we delete this, but it'll now be inside of our Google Poly asset component rather than the image. And we have an error here, so let's double check. I think the error is that we didn't put this in brackets when we imported it, so you should import it correctly. And there you go, there's our thumbnail of our turkey. Now, one thing I wanted to do with this is I wanted to round off the corners just a little bit. I think it would look a little nicer, and the way you can do that is by setting a border radius. Let's give it a border radius of 10 and see how that looks. Okay, looks pretty good, and we can add some padding on the side later if we want to. Let's go ahead and add the display name and the author name down here. So we'll just add some text components. That one we'll put the display name. And here we'll put the author name. Let's give them each a style called styles.displayName and styles.authorName. Come down here and put display name and author name. And I think what I would like is for the display name to be bold and the author name to be normal. So we'll put font weight is bold, and we don't need to put anything in author name because by default it will be normal. So let's go back to our turkey object.json reference and figure out what the property names are, and they're just called display name and author name. So we should be able to just add in this.props.asset.displayname, make sure to put it in brackets, and this.props.asset.authorName. And if we save it, we should now see our text below the image. Great. Let's also put a style on our view called styles.container. And let's also align our text using the text align property to be in the center. And maybe that's not how we do it. Maybe we need to put align items here, center. Okay, so everything's centered there. We can delete that if we want. All right, so now we've got a component we can use to display our search results. It'll look like this. And actually, we want to do one last thing. I think what I'd like to do is have users be able to click on the asset. So let's add a touchable opacity import from React Native. And let's surround the whole thing. Instead of a view, we'll surround it with a touchable opacity. And touchable opacities need an onPress property. So for onPress, we'll say this.props.onPress. And in our default props, we will initialize onPress to be a function that doesn't do anything. And this serves as both a reminder that you should pass in an onPress property, and it helps to prevent crashes in case somebody forgets the onPress property. When it tries to call this, it'll just call a function that doesn't do anything rather than crashing. So let's save it and try clicking on it. As you can see, the opacity changes, so it gives the user an indication that it was clicked on. So that should be all we need to display our search results. All right, let's return to our Google Poly class that we were working on earlier and make a few adjustments to it that can make the searching process a little bit more convenient for us. I'll switch over here. This was the function get3model that we were working on to get the 3D model, which will collapse now because we won't be working with that. And as a quick summary, we have two functions in our class, one called getQueryURL, which just gives us the URL that we can use to call the API, and getSearchResults, which takes keywords and a next page token and returns us the results of the API in the form of a promise. When users click search, they're going to be given the first page of data, which for us will be 10 results because we've hard-coded our page size to be 10. I also want a button down at the bottom called Load More, which when they press will load the next 10 results using our next page token. And what I'm going to do for my application is just concatenate all of the results into one big array and show them all as many times as they click load more. That may not be ideal for your application. You may only want to show 10 results at a time or 20 or however many and implement some sort of pagination scheme. So feel free to make modifications as you need for your application. Since I'm going to have all the results in one big array, it makes sense to keep track of that array in our class. So I'm going to add a new property called this.currentResults, which I'm going to initialize to a blank array. I'm also going to track the next page token as a member variable, and I'm also going to track the keywords as a member variable. So instead of getSearchResults taking in keywords in a next page token, we're actually going to pull it from the member variables here. So we'll say this.keywords and this.nextPage token. And down here when we receive the results, instead of returning them as a promise, we're going to append them to our current results array. So the way that we can do that is setting this.currentResults equal to this.currentResults.concat data.assets. And that will concatenate the results of the API to our current array. Let's also set our next page token to the next page token that we're given, which is data.nextPageToken. And we can actually keep our promise here to return the results of this specific call if we want. And so users will be able to get the next 10 results from this promise, or they can get all the results by just calling their instance of Google Poly.currentResults. Now we need a way to set the keywords so that when getSearchResults is called, it actually has some keywords. So let's make a new function right here called setSearchParams, and it will take one input of keywords. And what this function will, when it will be called, is whenever the user clicks search. So if the user types in Turkey and clicks search, what we want it to do is clear out all of the existing results, all of the existing next page token stuff, and start over with a brand new search of Turkey. So we're going to do is set this.currentResults equal to a blank array. So any results that are already in there are wiped out. This.nextPageToken is going to be set to blank, and this.keywords is set to the input keywords. So how the UI is going to work is the user will type in their search result here, their search query here. They'll click search, which we'll call setSearchParams and reset all of our member variables. Then it will call getSearchResults, which is going to search based on the keywords that are given and the next page token, which for the first page will be blank. That's going to call the API, grab our results, and append them to our current results array, which is currently blank. It's going to set our next page token, and it'll return a promise with the assets for just that query. Then if the user was unsatisfied with the first 10 results, they can click the Load More button, which we haven't added yet, and it'll call getSearchResults again, which will run the query, append the next 10 results to our current results array, set the next page token, and return the results 11 through 20. So let's save that and give it a shot. All right, so let's flip over to our home screen and try to implement the new changes to the API in our UI. So we talked about having a Load More button, so why don't we go ahead and add that. Let's come down here to where we've got our search button. Let's add another button called Load More. And when it's pressed, it will call this.onLoadMorePress, which we need to implement. So we'll say onLoadMorePress. And we've now got two buttons that we need to implement. So as we said, when search is pressed, we're going to grab the text out of the search box and call setSearchParams. So let's get the text, which is equal to this.state.searchQuery. Instead of calling it text, why don't we call it keywords? and we'll say this dot Google Poly, which is our instance of the Google Poly class, dot set search params, and we'll give it keywords. So now we have set our search params. We've wiped out any results that may have already been there and set our keywords. Now we want to actually call get search results. So we'll say this dot Google Poly dot get search results. Takes no inputs now, but it returns a promise. So we'll say dot then function with assets, and we can do whatever we want with our assets here. But I think what we're going to do is, instead of using these assets, we're going to use this dot Google Poly dot current results, which is going to have all the results of every query that we run. So let's come up to our constructor and let's add a new state parameter called current results, which is initialized to a blank array. And whenever the query returns, we're going to set state.currentResults to the Google Poly.current results. And setting the state will trigger a re-render with the new results. So up here we're going to say this.setState current results is going to be equal to this.Google Poly.current results. And since we're referencing this inside of a function, we need to bind the this context, so we'll add .bind this right here. Okay, and load more press should do almost the exact same thing, except it won't reset our keywords or our search parameters because we want to keep those the same, but it will call get search results to get the next page worth of data. So let's just copy and paste that down here. You could factor this out into a separate function if you'd like. I don't think it's necessary in this particular case. Let's add a console.log here with our assets, just to make sure that we're actually getting data. And before we test it out, we do need to make one slight change back in our Google Poly class. Again, since we're referencing this inside of a function here, we need to bind the this context by calling .bind with this. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to access this .current results or this .next page token. So let's save and try out our new search. We'll open up the Expo XDE and we'll type in Turkey, do a search, and as you can see there are some results. And if we click load more, I believe we got some more results. So that's just a quick check to make sure that there weren't any huge errors. Let's now actually display the results on the screen. Alright, so back in our home screen, to display the results, we're just going to display a Google Poly asset for every asset in our this.state.current results. So one way we can do that is by using a loop, or we can also use the map function. So let's make a function right here called render current results. And what this is going to do is we'll use the map function to map all of our current results to a Google Poly asset component. So we'll say return this.state.currentResults.map. Now we'll take a function with an asset and an index, and we will return a Google Poly asset whose asset property is equal to the asset that we're currently mapping. And since we're going to have multiple of these, we need to set a key, otherwise you'll get a yellow box error, and we'll just set the key equal to the index. And instead of displaying our Turkey object, we're going to call this.render current results. And why don't we make a small modification here, which is we'll check the length of this.state.current results, and we'll say if this.state.current results.length equals 0, then we're just going to return text that says no results. That way we know that we don't have any results. And if there are results in there, we'll call our map function. So let's save that, and I just realized that we didn't call the function here, so add the parentheses there and call it, save it again. Okay, so we've got no results. Let's search for turkey. Click search, and there you have it. We have our results, and I'm unable to scroll, so we need to change this to a scroll view to allow scrolling. Save it again and try it one more time. Click search, and there you go. We have a list of 10 results related to turkeys. If you take a look at the last one, it's this bird with a red head. Let's load more and make sure that we got 10 more. Okay, so that was our previous last one. And here are 10 more turkeys. Actually, it's only 3, so that must have been the end of the results for turkey. Let's try changing the results again to dog and click search. And well, the first 2 results are foxes, and that's one thing I've noticed is this, the keywords query gives you sometimes unexpected results. As you can see, there's a lot of animals on here that aren't actually dogs. I'm not really sure what's going on with that, but the API is working correctly. It's just kind of giving you strange results. Alright, so let's try to make our search results look a little bit nicer. We'll probably come back to this later on and clean it up a bit, but we can do a couple of things right now. For one, I think we can actually fit 2 results per row, and I also would like to move the load more button down to the bottom, so when you've scrolled down here, you can click load more right there rather than having to scroll back up. And we may make a couple of modifications to the text input. So let's start off with adding 2 results per row. And to make things a little bit easier for us, since we may be refreshing and researching over and over again, let's initialize our search query to be turkey so that every time we reload, we don't have to type in a search query and click search. We've got turkey right there. We can go ahead and click search and get our results. All right, so to get 2 per row, we're going to update our render current results function. We still want the no results text if we have no results, but let's try to put that in the center instead. So let's add a view here, and we'll say styles flex1, align items center, and into the view. So now the text will look a little bit nicer when there are no results. And down here, instead of using the map function, let's create an array called results, where we'll put all of our Google Poly assets, and let's do a loop for var I equals 0, I is less than this dot state dot current results dot length, and I plus plus. What this is going to do is it's going to grab 2 results at a time, put them into a view with a flex direction of row, and show all of those results. So first thing we should do is we should check if we're on the very last result and we don't have an extra one, then we don't want to try to add 2. So let's check if I equals this dot state dot current results dot length minus 1. Then we're just going to return a Google Poly asset whose asset is now equal to this dot state dot current results I, and whose key is now I. And we'll break from the function. But if we're not on the last one, which means we do have at least one more, we can, oh, I'm sorry, this should not be returned, this should be results dot push, because we're adding to the results array, and then down here, after the loop, we're going to return our results like that. We'll just delete the map function right there. Okay, so now in this section of code, we know that we've got at least one more result, so we'll say results.push, and in this case, we're going to push a view, which has a style of flex direction row. And inside of that view, we're going to have 2 Google Poly assets, one for the current result, one for the next result. So we'll say I here, and I plus 1, I plus 1. And since we're looking at 2 results at a time, we want to change our loop to be I plus equals 2. So instead of going up by 1 each iteration, we'll go up by 2 each iteration. And that should be all. Let's save and take a look at what our results look like now. One thing I do want to do is turn off the disable yellow box feature so that if we do get any errors, we'll see them. Let's refresh. And we'll click search to get our search results. And we are still getting this key error, but we are getting 2 results per page, it looks like. So let's figure out what's wrong with this error first. I believe it's because the view doesn't have a key. So we'll set the key here equal to, let's say, row plus I. Okay, we've eliminated the error. We got 2 results per row, but we want to center these a little bit and maybe add some padding in between them. So to center them, let's put our results into a view. So we'll say return view with the style of flex1 and align items center. And inside of that view, we'll put our results. Get rid of that. And to add some padding in between these, we'll go into the Google Poly Asset component. And in our container style, let's just add some padding of about 10. So I'll save that. Save our home screen. May have to refresh again. And click search. And there you go. We've got some padding in between rows. 2 results per row. Everything's looking good there. So we'll collapse this because it looks good right now. And we said we were going to put the load more button towards the bottom. That's easy to do. We'll just cut this and paste it right below the results. And if we click search, we've got our results with a load more button down here. And for some reason it's getting cut off at the end. So why don't we just add a view here with some padding on the top just to give us some extra space so we can see everything. I'll click search, load more, great. Now something I just noticed is we're getting a load more button even if we don't have any results, and I actually would like to hide that button until we have some initial results. So an easy way to do that is with the ternary operator. Let's take our load more button and put it into brackets and give us some space here. And what we'll do is we'll say if this.state.current results.length equals 0, we're just going to show a blank view. But if it's not 0, we're going to show the load more button. So we'll save and refresh that. Now we're not getting the load more button. Once we have our initial results, we've got a load more button there, and we have some padding down below. Now for one last UI change, let's update our text input a little bit and make it look a little nicer. So I'll come to the text input here. We've already got some properties. I want to set the auto capitalize equal to false. Actually, I think it takes a string, so let's set it to none. And for the style, I want to add some padding, some margin on the horizontal of 10. Let's refresh and see how that looks. Okay, so it added a little bit of spacing here, and let's also give it a border radius of 10 to round off the edges. And I don't like how close the text is to the end of the box, so we'll also add some padding horizontal of 10 as well. Great. Now we're ready to display the object that the user actually selects on the screen rather than the turkey. As you can see, I'm now streaming my actual device because we're going to need the camera. And I've once again disabled yellow boxes by uncommenting this line because they were getting in the way of the button. So just as a quick test, I'm going to try adding a turkey again to make sure everything was working properly. And there you have it. I clicked add turkey and we got a turkey added right there. So in order to keep track of the user selection, we're going to add a new state variable, and we'll call this one current asset. And that's going to be the 3D asset that the user has currently selected. And rather than defaulting this to an empty object, why don't we default it to the turkey object, so that way before the user has even done a search, they'll have an object that they can add to their screen. I'm also going to delete these two state properties because we recently extracted them into the searchable Google Poly asset list. I'll save that. And we need to set our current asset whenever it is chosen from the search menu. So if we come down here, this is where our searchable Google Poly asset list is, and we need some way for this component to tell us when an asset has been chosen. And if you recall when we created the Google Poly asset component, we gave it an onPress function, so we can utilize that to determine when an asset has been pressed. So let's come into our searchable Google Poly asset list component, and let's make a new property, and this one will be called onAssetPress. And we'll initialize that to a function that doesn't do anything. Let's scroll down to our renderCurrentResults function and call the onAssetPress function anytime an asset is pressed. So we'll open this up, and here's where we're adding our Google Poly assets. Let's format the text just a little bit, add some line breaks in there to make it a little bit easier to see when these properties start getting pretty long. Oops. And we want to implement the onPress function for the Google Poly asset, and we want to call this .props.onAssetPress. But we run into a problem, which is this is running in a loop, and we need to know exactly which asset was pressed. So why don't we come up here, and why don't we add an asset here to indicate that this function will take an asset. And we'll come back into our Google Poly asset function, and the onPress will also provide us with an asset. And when the onPress is pressed here, what it's actually going to do is call this .props.onPress, and it's going to give it this .props.asset. So whenever a Google Poly asset is pressed, it's going to call its onPress function and give this asset object right here as an input. So we'll save that and come back into our searchable Google Poly asset list. Now we need to implement the onPress for the other Google Poly assets that we've added. Let's add a few line breaks here to make it a little easier to read. And we'll put onPress here. And onPress here. Let's save that. All right, as you recall, we're currently adding the object in the onAddTurkeyPress button, and we're assigning the object to a variable called this.turkey. Since it won't always be a turkey, I think we should rename our function and our object. So why don't we name the variable to this.3model equals object, and let's check where that's being used. I think it's being used in onRender. This is where we're rotating it. So instead of this.turkey, we'll say this.3model. And instead of onAddTurkeyPress, why don't we say onAddObjectPress, and come down here, and instead of saying add turkey, we'll say add object and call onAddObjectPress. And in the Google Poly.getThreeModel function call, instead of passing in turkey object, what we're actually going to do is pass in the current asset. So we'll say this.state.currentAsset, and since we initialize it to the turkey object, we can be sure that it will always have some sort of object in it. I'm going to delete this console.log that says adding turkey because we're no longer adding a turkey. And let's review. When we click add object, it will call this and it will load the asset that we currently have. And actually, one thing that we need to do is whenever this is pressed, we need to remove the current object. So one way of doing that is by saying this.scene.remove, and we want to remove this.3model. So you can only have one 3 model on the scene at a time. And we'll check if this actually exists. So if this.3 model, then we will remove it. So that way, if they click add object and it adds a turkey, and then they go and search for something else and click add object again, it'll first remove that turkey and then add the new object that they want to add. Let's also close the modal anytime an asset is chosen from the search. So we'll come down to our onAssetPress function in the home screen. And after setting the asset, we're also going to set state search modal visible equal to false. So let's save this and test it out. Alright, so I'll hold my phone up and press add object, which should give us the turkey by default. If we look around a little bit, there's the turkey. Now let's do a search, and how about we search for duck? And there's the turkey, we don't want to use that. How about we take this penguin, and if we click add object, you can see the turkey goes away and the penguin gets loaded in. Now that the main portions of the app are just about complete, we're going to do a little bit of cleanup to make it look a little nicer, and the cleanup will be done in no particular order. So let's begin. Let's move over to the home screen, and the first thing I want to do is make these buttons down here at the bottom look a little bit nicer. So I'm going to use icons instead of buttons, and we can use the icon library that comes with Expo, or you can install the library. It's called React Native Vector Icons. So we will import material community icons as icon from React Native Vector Icons. And we'll come down to our render method, and instead of these buttons, we're going to place an absolutely positioned view on the bottom. So we'll add a view here and give it a style. So this view is going to be position absolute, and it will have a bottom of 0 so that it appears on the bottom. We're also going to add flex 1, flex direction of row, and that should be it for this one. Let's also add a subview. This one will also say is flex 1, flex direction row, and we'll set the justify content to space between so that we'll have all of our buttons spaced out. Now for the buttons, we're going to use icons. The icon library comes with a component also called icon.button, and you give it the name of an icon and an onPress event. So we'll have this button be our add object button. So we'll say onPress equals this.onAddObjectPress, and we'll look up the name later. We'll add another one call for our search button. So this will call this.onSearchModalPress. And I actually want to add one more button that we haven't implemented yet, which will be called remove object, and that's just going to remove the current object if you don't want to have one on there. So say icon.button, name is blank for now, and the onPress equals this.onRemoveObjectPress. Let's go ahead and implement the onRemoveObjectPress. Let's scroll up, and here's our onAddObjectPress, so we'll put it right below that. OnRemoveObjectPress. And we've actually already done the logic for that here, so why don't we copy that, paste it, and instead of doing this, we'll just say this.onRemoveObjectPress. Alright, we'll save that and refresh. And as you can see, we've got 3 placeholders for icon buttons, but we don't have any actual icons because we left the names blank. They've also got blue backgrounds, which we don't want. So let's go ahead and add a background color of transparent for each of these. I'll copy that and paste it here. And to figure out the icon names, we can go over to the Material Community Icons website. And for add object, I think we'll use a plus sign. So let's search for plus and see if we can find one. There's one, and the name is just called plus. So we'll put plus here. Or we could use the plus box outline potentially. Let's look up minus for the remove. And so we'll add minus for this one. Maybe we'll just use the plain ones. And then for the search, let's look for a magnifying glass. And maybe if we type search, there's a magnifying glass and the name of it is magnify. So we'll type that in and save it and see how it looks. And you can barely see them because they're white, but they should be a little more visible once we've removed these buttons, and we might make them a bit bigger as well. So we can go ahead and delete these buttons now since we've implemented them as icon buttons. Let's save again. And there we have it. We can test these out. I'm going to click the magnifying glass button, and as you can see, our search box comes up. Okay, so let's just go ahead and make these icons a slightly bit larger. So we'll set the size equal to, let's try 30 and see how that looks. And I'll make it about 40, I think would be good. So we'll set all of these to 40. All right. And that looks pretty good. Nice big buttons, should be easy to press. Try it out. Okay, if I click add for add an object, we get our turkey. Perfect. Next, I'm just going to scan through some of the files we made, and I'm going to delete any debugging code that we may have added. I'm also going to add comments. Since I've been dictating the code, I didn't really add any comments as I was going, but it's a good idea to add comments, preferably while you're writing the code, but if you have to, you can go back and add them at the end, as I'm doing now. I usually like to put comments on top of each function, explaining what it does. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, so maybe I'll leave them out for this video. So I'm scanning through here. I want to find any time where we do a console.log and we don't actually want to log something. So in this case, we're just logging the current asset state. I'll put a comment here, remove the current object, and then this one will be add the current object. And take out some of these white spaces. This is for rotate the object, render. That all looks good. Okay, so this file looks pretty good. Let me just collapse everything. Okay, and remember we can take this out. One other thing, we can go ahead and delete this because we're no longer using that. We're just only using the searchable Google Poly asset list. I'll save that, and I'll jump into the Google Poly class that we created. There's just some blank lines here that we can remove. This one I will say returns a 3.js object. This one returns the results of the current query. Sets current search parameters and resets member variables. This one returns a query URL based on the given data. Okay, that one looks good. Let's go to Google Poly asset.js, look through this. Don't really see any problems with this one, so we'll keep that the same. And then our searchable Google Poly asset list. Look through this real quick. Okay, everything looks pretty good to me in this one, so we'll keep that the same as well. All right, so now let's work on the search page component a little bit and make this look a little bit nicer. I think one thing I want to do is put the cancel button up here to the right of the text input, and maybe let's put a magnifying glass icon next to the search placeholder text. So to get the icon, we need to also import the icon library. So let's import material community icons as icon from React Native vector icons. And we'll scroll down to where we're rendering the search input. And instead of just returning a text input, let's return a view that will contain the text input. So why don't we go ahead and just call this styles.search container and come down to our style sheet and create search container. And what we want that to do is have a flex of 1, a flex direction of row, and set align items to center so the magnifying glass will line up. And I'm going to collapse these so I can find where we're working at easier. Okay, so inside of this view we're going to add our icon with a name of magnify. Let's give it a color of some kind of gray, so we'll say DDDD. And the size we'll say is 20. And right next to that we're going to take our text input and put it right there. And since these styles are a little long, we'll cut these and instead put styles.search text input. Come down to our style sheet and search text input. Okay, so we'll save that and see how it looks. While that's loading, I'm going to reformat these. Okay, so as we can see, the text input is not stretching all the way to the end like we want it to. So we can fix that by adding flex of 1. And also I want the border to be around both the magnifying glass and the text input. So I'm going to take the border width and put that up here. And I'm going to take the border radius and put that up here as well. And we want to add a little bit of horizontal spacing between the edge of the screen. So on the container, I'll add a margin horizontal of 10. And I'm going to remove the margin horizontal from here so that the search won't be so far away from the magnifying glass. So I'll save that and see how that looks. Okay, it's looking much better. I think we should change the color of the border maybe. So on the container we'll set border color also to have that gray that we've been using. And let's go ahead and move the cancel button up to the right side of the text input as well. So let me collapse more of this stuff. And we're going to grab the cancel button, which I believe is right here. Take this out, and we're going to put it, well, we don't want it to be inside of the border, so we need to put it below the view, which has the border, and then we'll have to wrap all of this inside of another view. And this view should also have a flex of 1 and a flex direction of row. Let's save that and see how it looks. Okay, perfect. And we'll set this to align items center just to be safe. And I think for this one we'll want to put the margin horizontal to 10 and take it away from this one. Okay, so it's looking pretty good. I can test the cancel button. So when I click that, the search page goes away. All right, now let's adjust some of the spacing of the magnifying glass and the search. So I'll come down here, and I think instead of having a padding horizontal on the text input, we'll add the horizontal padding to the icon itself, so that way it spaces out a little bit away from the edge there, and we'll have the same spacing there. So on our icon, I think we can give it a style, and we'll say padding horizontal 10. Okay, it's looking better, although I still think there's too much space here. So let's change this padding horizontal to be padding left of 10. Then we'll have a padding right of, let's just try 3 and see how that looks. And while that's loading, another thing I wanted to change was the no results text. If we don't have any results, I want to make that a little bit bigger and make it italicized. So that's in render current results. And here's the style for our text. Why don't we call this styles.noResultsText. And we'll come down here, make a new style called noResultsText. And we're going to make it a little bit bigger, so we'll say font size of 18, font style, italic. And why don't we put some padding on the top of about 50 so it has some more space away from the search button. Save that. Oops, I spelled italic wrong. So okay, it's looking pretty good in my opinion. I think one final thing we'll do is we'll make it so that when you press enter on your keyboard, it will automatically perform the search. And I can't remember the name of the property, but I can come over to the documentation, and if we scan through some of these properties, we'll probably find it. I believe it's on submit editing. So this says it's a callback that's called when the text input submit button is pressed. So in our text input up here, we're going to say on submit editing, and we're going to give it the function that happens when search is pressed, which is this.onSearchPress. We'll say this.onSearchPress, and let's test that out. If we wanted, we could also change our keyboard type to be maybe web search, although that's iOS only, or we'll just keep the default. Okay, so if I open this up and I search for dog, and I'm going to press return on the keyboard, and there we have it, it's showing the results. Now one thing I've noticed just now is that this text isn't centered, and I think earlier we tried to make it centered, so let's figure out what's going on there. I'll open up Google Poly Asset and look at our styles. We may just need to add a text align of center to each of these. Let's save it and see if that's the problem. Well, that worked for the first one. Oh, I see, I accidentally put this in the thumbnail class. It should have been in the author name class. Okay, one last time, I'll search for dog, and it looks like all the text is centered. And keep trying to click that. Okay, perfect. All right, and there's a bug I want to fix, which is when we search for something such as dog, we get the results, and if we cancel the search and then bring it back up, the results are no longer there, but we have the load more button, and I believe the problem for this is that we're not correctly initializing our current results array, which is in our state, which you'll find in the constructor. So instead of initializing it to a blank array, I think we should set it to this.props.googlepoly.current_results. And we'll save that and test it out. So I'll do a search for dog, and I've got my results, cancel, and bring this back up, and the results are there. If I load, let's try loading more. Looks like we have some layout issues for longer strings of text. Okay, I'll cancel that, bring it back up, and there are the full results. And let's try changing our result to duck. There we go, and another layout issue with long text. To fix that layout issue in our Google Poly Assets, we'll come over to the Google Poly Asset component, and we'll set a width constraint on our text components. We'll set the width to be the same width as the thumbnail. So here in our display name, we'll set a width of 150, and for author name, also a width of 150. And refresh the app. And we'll do that same search for duck. And if we scroll down, as you can see now, the text is on multiple lines rather than pushing things over.